High above the valleys of central Italy, long before the age of tanks and bombers, stood a monastery that had watched over the world for more than 1,000 years. Monte Cassino, a fortress of stone, faith, and history. Founded in the 6th century by Saint Benedict, it was one of Europe's oldest sanctuaries. For centuries, its bells echoed through the mountains, calling monks to prayer and pilgrims to reflection. Kings and emperors had walked its halls. Armies had passed beneath its walls, but none had dared to destroy it. It was, for generations, untouchable, sacred ground. When war came to Italy in 1943, Monte Cassino stood once again between two worlds, the old and the new, peace and war. The German army had retreated north, building a line of defense across the country that would stop the Allied advance dead in its tracks. It was called the Gustav Line, and at its center, like a crown on a mountain, was Monte Cassino. The Allies called Italy the soft underbelly of Europe. They were wrong. The mountains were steep, the valleys narrow, the rivers deep, and every village had become a fortress. The Germans, masters of defensive warfare, turned nature itself into their ally. Bunkers, trenches, mines, and machine gun nests carved into stone, all connected by a web of roads that snaked up to the Abbey. From its height, the monastery overlooked the Liri Valley, the only path toward Rome. Whoever held Cassino held the gateway to Italy. In October 1943, the Allied armies, American, British, French, Indian, New Zealand, and Polish divisions, reached the foot of the mountain. They expected a quick victory. They found hell instead. The winter was brutal. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud. Trucks sank, mules froze, and men slept in foxholes filled with water. The Germans waited in the mountains, invisible. Their artillery zeroed in on every trail. Every step forward cost blood. And through it all, the monastery loomed above, silent, untouched, its white walls shining through the mist like a ghost from another age. At first, no one dared to attack it. The Vatican had declared it neutral. Pope Pius X had made it clear Monte Cassino was a house of God, not a fortress of men. Inside, dozens of Benedictine monks lived alongside hundreds of refugees. Women, children, the elderly, all seeking safety within its ancient walls. The abbot, Gregorio Diamare, had sworn to protect them all. He believed no army would dare to desecrate the abbey. But on the slopes below, soldiers whispered otherwise. The Americans and British were convinced that German artillery observers were inside, directing fire down onto the valley. Every shell that landed near Allied trenches felt like proof. Scouts reported flashes from the windows. Photographs seemed to show men moving among the cloisters. To the soldiers dying below, Monte Cassino was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress. The truth was more complex. The Germans had occupied the hills around the abbey, not the abbey itself. They had placed their machine guns in caves, in stone terraces, in the ruins of nearby villages, but never within the sacred walls. For them, Monte Cassino was a line they dared not cross. General Fridolin von Senger und Ettelin, commander of the German Nationalwehr Panzer Corps, was himself a devout Catholic. He ordered his men to stay out of the abbey. He even sent word to the Vatican promising its protection. For months he kept that promise, but faith is fragile in war. Rumors grew, commanders demanded action, and above all, the Allies were desperate to break through the Gustav Line. Rome was only 80 miles away, but it might as well have been a continent. The soldiers at the front, men who had watched their friends die in the mud, began to hate the monastery. They saw in its white walls not holiness, but death. The decision would not come easily, nor would it come from the battlefield. It would come from the air and from far away. In December 1943, Allied reconnaissance flights began photographing the abbey daily. The images showed no visible guns, no troops, no trenches inside. But in the valleys below, shellfire continued to rain down. The commanders on the ground insisted the Germans must be using the monastery as an observation post. If they could not see the enemy, then surely he was hiding in plain sight. In war, doubt can kill faster than bullets, and doubt was spreading through every level of Allied command. Men questioned not only the enemy, but their own faith, in intelligence, in leadership, even in the meaning of sanctity. Could a holy place exist in a world consumed by destruction? Could something built for peace survive a war like this? The first assault on Cassino began in January 1944. American troops, many from the 34th Red Bull Division, tried to cross the Rapido River under heavy fire. They were met by machine guns and artillery that shredded their ranks. Entire companies disappeared into the mud. Those who reached the far bank found themselves trapped at the base of the mountain under constant bombardment. The attack failed. Still, the monastery stood untouched, its white walls marked only by smoke and dust. For the men below, it was an unbearable sight. They had fought for weeks, lost hundreds of comrades, and yet the Abbey remained, serene, indifferent, untouchable. To many, it had become a symbol of everything the war refused to destroy. To others, it was a target waiting to be erased. Winter deepened, snow covered the peaks, frost crept into every weapon, and the dead lay frozen in their trenches. The monks inside the abbey prayed by candlelight, the sound of distant explosions echoing through the halls. They could hear the war drawing closer, the crack of rifles, the whine of shells, the rumble of tanks below. But still, they believed God would protect them. For 14 centuries, Monte Cassino had survived barbarians, emperors, earthquakes, and wars. Surely it would survive this one. They were wrong. Outside, new orders were forming. In the coming weeks, the Allies would make a decision that would change the course of the Italian campaign and the fate of Monte Cassino forever. The mountain that had stood as a symbol of faith for 1,000 years was about to become a monument to the futility of war. By the start of 1944, Italy had become a land of mud, ruins, and rain. The Allied advance that had begun so confidently in Sicily now crawled forward inch by inch, hill by hill, village by village. Every mountain was defended, every bridge was wired with explosives, and at the center of it all, like a dagger drawn across the map, stretched the Gustav Line, a wall of steel and stone that cut the country in two. The Germans had chosen their ground well. They used the rivers, cliffs, and valleys as part of their defense. From the sea to the Apennine Mountains, their fortifications ran unbroken. Machine guns in caves, mortar pits hidden among olive trees, barbed wire strung across ancient vineyards. Every path north led to a crossfire. Monte Cassino sat at the heart of this line, its monastery rising nearly 500 meters above the valley floor. From its summit, a man could see for miles, over the Rapido River, across the Liri Valley, and down the winding road to Rome. Whoever controlled that height controlled the entire front. The German commander, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, knew this. He turned Cassino into a fortress of nature. Troops of the elite 1st Parachute Division, veterans of Crete and Russia, dug in around the mountain. They called themselves Die Grünen Teufel, the Green Devils. Hard, disciplined men who knew how to use terrain as a weapon. Their trenches blended into the rocks. Their positions were invisible until they fired. Even their mortars were buried, firing from tunnels. They moved at night, vanished by day. To the Allies below, it was like fighting ghosts. The first assaults came in January. The Americans attacked from the south, across the Rapido River. The river, swollen with rain, was a death trap. Boats capsized under machine gun fire, men drowned in icy water before they could reach the far bank. Those who did were met with mines and barbed wire. The fields were littered with bodies. Entire battalions were erased in a single night. Reports from the front were grim. Colonel after colonel sent the same message back. "We cannot move forward. The fire is too heavy. The enemy cannot be seen. The monastery overlooks us." From the command posts miles behind, the generals studied maps, photographs, and reconnaissance reports. The pattern was always the same. Every time the Allies tried to advance, the Germans adjusted their fire perfectly. It was as if they could see everything. The suspicion hardened. The monastery must be an observation post. In Naples, General Mark Clark of the U.S. Fifth Army debated with his staff. Some argued for restraint. No proof existed that the Germans had entered the Abbey. Others insisted it was impossible for them not to be using it. The argument was as much moral as military. To bomb a 1,000-year-old monastery was to destroy a symbol of civilization itself, but to leave it standing was to risk endless slaughter. Each day the casualty lists grew longer. Each day the monastery stood untouched, serene above the carnage. And each day, faith, in strategy, in intelligence, even in mercy, grew weaker. In early February, Allied intelligence intercepted radio signals from German positions near Cassino. They contained artillery coordinates that matched Allied locations exactly. For the staff officers, it was confirmation enough. For the men in the trenches, it was already decided. Below the mountain, the war ground on. Shellfire turned the town of Cassino into rubble. Streets became trenches, buildings became fortresses. The once beautiful city at the foot of the hill vanished beneath smoke and ash. Civilians hid in basements, praying for the noise to stop. When it did, it was only because there was nothing left to destroy. Inside the abbey, the monks could hear it all. Each explosion shook the windows, rattled the relics, sent dust falling from the ancient ceilings. The abbot still believed the Allies would never bomb them. He trusted their faith more than their fury. He was wrong, but not yet. On February 10th, a British reconnaissance pilot photographed the monastery under bright sunlight. The image, when enlarged, seemed to show figures moving among the ruins, small dark shapes along the walls. To analysts, it looked like German troops. To the monks, it was simply refugees seeking warmth. But the photograph would be shown in every briefing room, on every desk, in every argument that followed. By mid-February, Allied patience was gone. They had been fighting for months with no progress. Their supply lines were stretched, morale was sinking. Rome, the great symbolic prize, still lay far beyond the smoke. And above it all, the monastery of Monte Cassino remained untouched and defiant. The decision came quietly, not from the soldiers, not from the chaplains, but from the high command. The order was written in cold, bureaucratic words. The Abbey of Monte Cassino is to be destroyed by aerial bombardment. No one celebrated. Even those who believed it necessary understood what it meant. 1,000 years of history would be erased in minutes. A symbol of peace would become a weapon of war. On the morning of February 15, 1944, the bombers would come, not to conquer, but to obliterate. And when the dust cleared, nothing on that mountain would ever be the same again. The order spread through the ranks like a whisper. No announcements, no speeches, just sealed envelopes and coded messages passed from desk to desk, from Naples to the airfields of southern Italy. By dawn on February 15, 1944, every man involved in the operation knew what was about to happen, even if none of them wanted to admit it. Monte Cassino, the heart of the Gustav line, the ancient monastery of Saint Benedict, was to be wiped from the face of the earth. In the command tents, the arguments had ended. Some generals still questioned the need. Others spoke of military necessity, of breaking the German line once and for all. But in the war rooms, the decision had already become history. To them, it was simple arithmetic. If the enemy could see from that height, the men below would die. If the monastery fell, perhaps they might live. At dawn, Allied pilots gathered beside their aircraft. Rows of B-17 flying fortresses and B-25 Mitchells stood gleaming under the pale Italian sun, their bomb bays loaded with thousands of pounds of explosives. The crews were briefed. The target was not a city, not a factory, but a monastery. The pilots were told that German troops occupied the building. They were told that its destruction would save lives. They were told not to question the order. Miles away in the valley below, soldiers looked up at the mountain through mist and smoke. Some watched in silence, others muttered prayers. Many had fought within sight of the Abbey for months. They had seen their friends fall beneath artillery fire that seemed to come from the heavens themselves. They believed this would end it. They wanted it to end. Inside the monastery, the monks rose for morning prayers. They had lived through months of shelling and sleepless nights, but still they followed their rituals. Candles were lit, Latin psalms whispered through cold corridors. The abbot, Gregorio di Amare, moved quietly among the refugees, nearly 200 souls huddled in the great halls, wrapped in blankets, clutching rosaries and icons. He had received no warning. He believed the monastery's neutrality would protect them. At 9:25 a.m., the first bombers appeared. Tiny silver dots high above the mountains, glinting in the sunlight, moving in formation. At first, the monks thought they were headed elsewhere, perhaps to Rome, perhaps to the front lines beyond the valley. But the formation turned, the engines roared directly overhead, and then the sky began to fall. The first bomb struck the courtyard. The ground shuddered. Dust burst through every doorway, statues cracked, walls split. Refugees screamed, monks threw themselves to the floor, candles extinguished by the shockwave. Within minutes, the ancient roof collapsed, burying centuries of manuscripts, paintings and relics beneath tons of stone. A second wave followed, then a third, each more precise, each more devastating. Outside, Allied troops watched from their positions across the valley. They saw the monastery disappear beneath clouds of dust and flame. Even hardened veterans turned away. The bombardment lasted more than 3 hours. Hundreds of bombs, high explosive, incendiary, fragmentation poured down upon the mountain. When it was over, nothing remained but shattered columns and rising smoke. The Abbey of Monte Cassino, founded in 529, destroyed in 1944. When the dust finally cleared, silence returned. The mountain that had once gleamed white now smoldered grey. The cross that had crowned its tower lay buried beneath rubble. Of those inside, more than 100 civilians and monks were dead. Those who survived emerged dazed, their faces coated in ash, the air thick with the smell of stone and death. From the valley, Allied observers radioed the result. Target completely destroyed. In London and Washington, reports celebrated the success. The monastery was gone. The Gustav line would soon fall. But the truth was far darker. Within hours of the bombing, German paratroopers moved into the ruins. They had never been inside before. Now the broken walls provided perfect cover, observation points, firing positions, strongholds made by the very bombs meant to destroy them. What had been a sanctuary was now a fortress. For the soldiers below, the battle had only begun. The mountain had been leveled, but the enemy was stronger than ever. And the Allies had gained nothing, except the guilt of having destroyed one of the holiest places in Europe. The monks who survived were escorted down the mountain under white flags. Among them, the abbot carried the only thing he could save, the bones of St. Benedict, wrapped in cloth. Behind him, smoke still rose from the ruins of his monastery. He did not look back. That evening, Allied soldiers climbed toward the wreckage, stepping over craters and broken stone. They found nothing living, only silence, twisted iron, and the faint sound of wind moving through the shattered arches. The monks' chant had been replaced by the echo of artillery. In Naples, General Clark read the first battlefield report in silence. He knew the decision had been irreversible. He signed the paper without a word. The war would move on, but something far older than war had been lost. From that day, Monte Cassino was no longer a symbol of peace. It was a monument to misunderstanding, and for the men who would soon climb its ruins, it was only the beginning. The mountain was gone. The enemy was still there, and the bloodiest phase of the battle was about to begin. When the last bomber disappeared over the horizon, silence fell across the valley, heavy, unnatural silence. It was not peace, only the pause between two storms. The mountain of Monte Cassino, once crowned by white stone and gold, now lay in ruins. Smoke drifted upward in slow spirals, and from within the shattered walls came the sound of fire crackling through ancient wood. For the men watching from below, it felt like the world had stopped. Even the wind seemed unwilling to move. They had witnessed the destruction of something that had stood since before their nations were born. No one cheered. No one spoke. In the distance, artillery rumbled. The Germans were still there. When the first Allied patrols advanced toward the mountain, they found the valley unrecognizable. Where olive groves and vineyards had once stood, there were only craters and mud. The riverbanks were scorched, the air thick with dust. The town of Cassino itself was gone, not captured, not conquered, simply erased. But the enemy had survived. Inside the ruins of the monastery and throughout the mountain slopes, the German paratroopers were already moving. They had turned the rubble into a fortress. Each collapsed wall became a firing point. Each crater became a shelter. The bombardment had done their work for them. From behind the shattered stones, they watched the Allied columns advance and waited. They had seen destruction before, in Crete, in Russia, in every corner of Europe where they had fought, but never had they seen the world's faith turn to dust. Now they swore the ruins would not fall easily. This was not just another hill. It was now their stronghold of defiance. The Allied plan was simple, on paper. After the bombing, the monastery was to be taken by a combined assault of British, Indian, and New Zealand troops. The path was narrow and exposed, running through broken towns and open slopes. But intelligence claimed the Germans were shattered, their morale broken, their defenses destroyed. They were wrong. On February 16th, the assault began. Indian troops of the 4th Division climbed the steep ridges north of Cassino, while New Zealanders advanced through the valley below. Artillery roared from both sides, shaking the mountains. Each explosion sent stones cascading down the slopes. The ruins of the Abbey loomed above them like a monument to futility. The higher they climbed, the stronger the resistance became. From hidden caves and rubble positions, the German paratroopers opened fire. Their machine guns raked the mountainside, bullets striking sparks from rock. Every yard was contested. Every step forward left bodies behind. The air smelled of cordite and smoke. The wounded slid down the slopes, calling for medics who could not reach them. The living pressed forward, their boots slipping on shattered marble and ice. Above them, the ruins burned against a grey sky. It was as if the monastery itself refused to die quietly. For 4 days, the fighting raged. Every assault failed. The Allied artillery could not reach the defenders without hitting their own men. The weather worsened. Rain turned to sleet, sleet to snow. Visibility dropped to nothing. Even the aircraft were grounded. By February 20th, the valley had become a graveyard of machines and men. Tanks lay burned out, their tracks twisted, their crews frozen inside. The town below, what little remained of it, was filled with smoke and ghosts. The Germans held firm. Their commanders radioed back to Kessel Ring, "The monastery is ours." When word reached Allied headquarters, disbelief turned to despair. The bombardment had failed. The Abbey's destruction had achieved the opposite of its purpose. The Gustav line was stronger than ever. Still, orders demanded progress. In March, a new offensive was launched. Again, British and Indian troops advanced, this time at night, through rain that fell like glass. They moved silently, climbing over rubble and wire, trying to reach the ruins before dawn. But the Germans heard them coming. Flares lit the slopes like day. Machine guns opened up from every corner of the shattered monastery. The night turned to fire. By morning, the Allied lines had fallen back. Hundreds were dead. The mountain remained untouched. For those who survived, the battle for Cassino became a nightmare without end. They began to hate the place, not for its enemy, but for its indifference. It was as if the mountain itself wanted them to fail. Reporters later described Cassino as a miniature Stalingrad. Every inch of ground had to be won twice, once against the enemy and once against the terrain. Men fought from crater to crater, sometimes only a few meters apart, unable to see the sky for the smoke. The sound never stopped. The mountain never slept. Through it all, the Germans held, outnumbered, outgunned, out of supplies, but not out of resolve. For them, Monte Cassino had become a test of will, a statement to the world that Germany would not yield easily. For the Allies, it was turning into a bleeding wound that refused to close. By April, after weeks of stalemate, both sides were exhausted. The valley was filled with the wreckage of war, burned tanks, frozen corpses, shredded flags. Spring came, but no flowers grew. Only the smell of gunpowder and death. In the ruins of the Abbey, the German paratroopers still waited, watching the horizon. They knew the next assault would come. It always did. They were right. A new army was gathering, one that would bring the final storm. Men who had come from thousands of miles away, carrying a promise of victory and vengeance. They were the Polish II Corps, veterans of exile and suffering. They had fought from North Africa to Italy, and now they stood at the foot of the mountain where the world had lost its faith. They would climb it again, not for glory, but for redemption. The ruins of Monte Cassino would burn once more, but this time it would end. Spring came late to the Liri Valley. The mountains were still grey, the wind still sharp, and the smell of death still lingered in the air. The ruins of Monte Cassino stood above it all, silent, broken, and undefeated. 3 Allied offensives had already failed. Thousands of men had died. The monastery still belonged to the Germans. Now it was the Poles' turn. The Polish II Corps, commanded by General Władysław Anders, arrived at the front in early May 1944. They were not fresh recruits. They were survivors, men who had escaped Soviet prisons, crossed the Middle East, fought in Africa, and now marched across Italy. For them, the war was personal. Their homeland was gone, divided between 2 empires. They had no country to return to, only the promise of honor and memory. To them, Monte Cassino was more than a battlefield. It was destiny. Anders' men studied the mountain with quiet determination. They knew what had happened before, the bombing, the slaughter, the endless failure. They walked among the wreckage of previous assaults, through the burned tanks and collapsed trenches, and they swore that this time would be different. The plan was simple in theory, impossible in practice. The Poles would attack directly up the slopes toward the monastery, while British and French units assaulted the flanks. The Germans held the high ground, fortified among the ruins, but the Allies would come with overwhelming firepower. Artillery batteries were positioned across the valley, ready to unleash the largest bombardment yet. The battle would begin on May 11th. On the eve of the assault, the valley was quiet. Rain fell softly on the wreckage, washing blood and dust into the mud. Soldiers wrote letters, cleaned their rifles, and waited. Many prayed, not for victory, but for survival. Some placed small Polish flags in their breast pockets, next to photos of families they hadn't seen in years. For them, every step up that mountain would be for home. At 11 p.m., the silence broke. 1,000 guns fired as one. The night turned white. The entire mountain shook under the bombardment. Shells rained down on the German positions, hundreds every minute, tearing apart what little was left of the monastery walls. The sound rolled through the valleys like thunder, echoing for miles. Men shouted to be heard over the noise, but their voices vanished in the storm. For 8 hours, the bombardment continued. At dawn, the infantry moved. The Polish 3rd Carpathian Division advanced on the right, the 5th Kresowa Division on the left. The climb began. The slopes were steep, littered with the dead of past battles. Every rock was mined, every path covered by machine guns. The Germans, the same paratroopers who had held the ruins for months, waited in silence, their rifles aimed, their nerves steel. When the Poles appeared through the smoke, they opened fire. The first wave fell, the second followed. The third crawled forward on their stomachs, bayonets fixed, grenades ready, the air filled with dust and screams. Snipers fired from shattered arches, mortars exploded among the rocks. Still the Poles climbed. They moved from crater to crater, from body to body, inch by inch. Officers led from the front, priests followed the soldiers, giving blessings under fire, carrying stretchers for the wounded. In the chaos, one chaplain was seen holding a crucifix high as bullets cut through the smoke around him. He never dropped it. By noon, the slopes were carpeted with the fallen. The heat rose, the air stank of cordite and blood, and the mountain seemed to devour everyone who dared approach it. Yet still they climbed. They would not stop. At 10:30 the next morning, after 36 hours of fighting, the Poles broke through the outer defenses. The Germans fell back toward the ruins. Hand-to-hand combat erupted among the stones that had once been the Abbey's walls. Grenades, pistols, bayonets. The battle had become primal. There was no line, no order, no mercy, only survival. By nightfall, the ruins were still contested. The mountain burned again, lit by tracer fire and flares that turned the smoke red. Both sides were exhausted, both nearly blind. Rain fell again, turning blood to mud. The screams of the wounded echoed through the shattered cloisters. When dawn came on May 18th, the shooting stopped. The Germans were gone. Under cover of darkness, they had withdrawn north. Only silence remained. Slowly, cautiously, Polish soldiers climbed the final steps toward the monastery. They carried rifles, but they were too tired to raise them. When they reached the top, they found only rubble, ashes, and the bones of the dead. In the center of the ruins stood a single cross, blackened, cracked, but still upright. At 10:20 a.m., a Polish patrol raised a white and red flag over the ruins. Below it, they planted a small wooden sign, "For our freedom and yours." For a moment, the valley was silent. Then the sound of distant artillery faded. For the first time in months, the guns were still. The Battle of Monte Cassino was over. The Gustav Line was broken. The road to Rome lay open. But victory came at a terrible price. Over 55,000 Allied soldiers had died in the campaign, including more than 4,000 Poles. The Germans had lost 20,000 of their own. The monastery that had stood for 14 centuries was gone, reduced to ruins by both sides, by faith and by fear. As the surviving monks returned weeks later, they walked through the wreckage in silence. They found the bones of their brothers among the stones. They gathered the relics they could still find and buried the rest. In the ashes of their sanctuary, they rebuilt an altar from shattered marble. They prayed, not for victory, but for forgiveness. For the soldiers who climbed that mountain, Monte Cassino would never be just a place. It would be a memory carved into bone, a name that lived in nightmares and silence. Some called it a victory, others called it a crime. All agreed. It was the end of something sacred. When the guns finally fell silent over Monte Cassino, the mountain was no longer a fortress. It was a grave. Smoke rose slowly from the ruins, twisting through the morning air like a final prayer. The smell of burned stone and cordite hung heavy for weeks, carried by the wind down into the Liris Valley. No birds returned, no bells rang, only silence. The Allied columns advanced toward Rome, leaving behind what they called victory, but those who had fought there never felt like victors. They left pieces of themselves on that mountain, pieces that no medal, no parade could ever replace. The road to Rome was open, but the cost was too great to celebrate. For the Polish soldiers, it was a strange, hollow triumph. They had captured the ruins that 3 armies before them could not, but their homeland remained in chains. They buried their comrades at the foot of the mountain in neat white rows, the Polish war cemetery at Monte Cassino. Each cross bore the same inscription, "For our freedom and yours." The cemetery looked peaceful, but every stone was carved from pain. The monks returned in the summer of 1944. They climbed the path they had once walked in prayer, now littered with shrapnel and shell casings. When they reached the top, they stopped in silence. The monastery that had stood for 14 centuries had been erased. The great dome was gone. The frescoes, gone. The library, which had held manuscripts older than most nations, gone. Even the tomb of St. Benedict had been cracked open by the blast. They began their work not with rebuilding, but with mourning. Every stone was blessed again. Every name of the dead was written in their records. They gathered the fragments of statues, relics, and books, piecing them together like the broken faith of the world around them. They prayed over the ashes of those who had died within the Abbey, refugees, monks, and strangers, all now united in the same earth. Across the valley, Allied engineers cleared the debris of war. The smell of fuel and death lingered in the soil. Even years later, farmers turning their fields found bullets, helmets, bones. The mountain refused to forget. After the war, the monastery became a wound in the conscience of Europe. In Rome, in London, in Washington, men spoke of military necessity. In Berlin, survivors of the German paratroopers remembered the battle with grim pride. But the monks of Cassino spoke of sorrow. They never blamed one side or the other, only the war itself. To them, every bomb that fell on that mountain had been a prayer unanswered. In 1946, the Vatican declared that Monte Cassino would be rebuilt, not as a new structure, but as a resurrection. Stone by stone, the Abbey would rise again on the same foundations, in the same shape, from the same materials. It took more than a decade. Thousands of workers labored in silence, guided by the few surviving blueprints and the memories of the monks. They used fragments of the old walls wherever possible, embedding the scars of the past into the new foundation. In 1964, 20 years after its destruction, the Abbey of Monte Cassino stood again, rebuilt not as a fortress, but as a symbol of faith reborn. At its reopening, Pope Paul VI spoke the words that would define the place forever. Where once there was destruction, may there now be understanding. Where once there was hatred, may there now be peace. Outside, veterans of every nation stood shoulder to shoulder, Polish, German, British, Italian, American. They said nothing. Some saluted, some prayed, all remembered. For the survivors, Cassino was a memory that never faded. They dreamed of it in sleep, the mountain, the smoke, the sound of bombs echoing through the sky. Some returned years later, grey-haired, to lay flowers on graves that bore their comrades' names. Others never returned at all. But in every soldier who fought there, something of Monte Cassino remained. The lesson that faith and war cannot share the same ground. Today, Monte Cassino stands once more in the sunlight. Its walls gleam white against the green hills of Italy, just as they did before the war. Visitors climb the winding road in silence, passing the cemeteries below. Polish, German, Italian, Allied, each one a testament to the same truth. No one truly wins a war like that. There are only survivors, and the silence of the dead. Inside the Abbey, The monks still rise before dawn. They light their candles, open their books, and chant the same prayers their brothers sang 15 centuries ago. Outside, the wind moves softly over the graves. The sound of it is almost like the whisper of distant voices, the echo of men who once fought and died for a hill that was never theirs to own. Monte Cassino has been rebuilt, but it is no longer what it was. It is not a monument to victory or defeat, but to endurance, the endurance of faith, of memory, and of humanity itself. The stones are new, but the soul of the place still carries the weight of all that happened there. The mountain stands quiet again. The bells ring once more, and when they do, their echo carries through the valleys, not as a call to war, but as a reminder that even after all the fire, the world can begin again.